Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Informational meeting of Tuesday, April 26, 2022 to order. As we always do, we start out with council remarks. Seeing none, we'll jump into our best and only presentation that we've been all waiting for a long time, the March 2022 financial statements. Sean Pritchard.
Good afternoon, Council. It's your lucky week. You get to hear from me twice in a row. So we covered the end of year financials last week. And so this will be the first financial report that you do see now that we've closed out 2021. This is your first glimpse, I guess, into how things are going so far for 2022. And so we'll get started. As we do in the past, you can take a look at the labor force and employment and where we are. You can see we have take a little bit of a downturn here over the last couple of months, but overall, we're up 2.3% from where we were employment-wise versus a year ago, and we're up about 1.4% over February 2021. So not significant growth, but a little bit of growth here you saw over the last year coming out of the COVID and people rejoining the workforce post-COVID era. The city's unemployment rate remained at 2.7%, very consistent with the average that we've had over the last 12 months. Statewide, just slightly higher at 2.9%, and of course on a national level, they are at 4.1% for the month of February. Inflation, as you're well aware from the news and just being out and about, is a continuing challenge, continuing to escalate. We don't know at what point we might hit a ceiling on this. It was at 8.5% in March, which again was a record since in the last 40 years, since December of 1981. Federal Reserve has begun to take some interest rate adjustments at 0.25% here in March, and predicting as many as 6 interest rate increases here over the course of the next year and a half, which will hopefully mitigate some of the impacts that we're seeing there, but certainly that's going to be a driving and a primary concern for us, for our community, for us city government, especially as we go into budgeting for the next year and trying to project or estimate kind of where we're going to be landing in terms of both expenses, but also where our revenue is going to be accounted for related to that inflation number. Overall, you can see that if you're looking by sector, energy, of course, is driving a large part of much of the inflation that you're seeing. At March, it was at 32%, driven by gasoline, which is up 48%, electricity up 11%, and natural gas up 22% from the same point where we were last year. Food costs, when you remove inflation, just food costs alone, inflation was 6.9%, so slightly below what you see the 8.5% average, and then all other goods and services is running at about 6.5% in totality for the month of March. Building permit valuations, you've probably seen some of the media reports and so forth on this. So through March, certainly had a large March in terms of some very large projects that were being permitted. It came in at $376 million so far for the year. That's up $163 million from the same time period, first quarter of last year, or an increase of about 77%. Unlike the last couple of years, it's been driven, like the last couple of years, it's been driven by new commercial, but it hasn't necessarily been driven by multifamily. Certainly multifamily is up year over year. That's up about $46 million through March, but what's really driving it is about $209 million in the the $138 million in the office, institutional, and educational development sectors. So the projects that have been coming through that really contributed to this, certainly the downtown project, Sharapa for $47 million, the Steel District, which was permitted at $29 million so far, and then 2 schools for Harrisburg, the 9th grade academy at $29 million, and the Harrisburg Middle School at $26 million. So all of those really contributed to that sector seeing such a large increase. Residential values experienced just a slight decline at $4 million, about $4 million less than where we were last year. But residential additions and remodels are up $5 million, so it's kind of offsetting what you're seeing in terms of the new home numbers in terms of valuations. In terms of actual units being permitted, certainly what sticks out there is the dramatic increase you're seeing on the multifamily side, with 934 multifamily units already permitted this year. It's over 100% increase from where we were last year. If you look back in 2020, there were 15, and we're at 934 for this year so far. So although in 2020 we did have a lot, they just trickled in toward the end of the year for that particular year. Overall, on the residential side, we had about the same number of units, 183, that we had seen for the last year, just down 4 there, and about the same for townhomes as well. On the sales tax collection side, so you can see if you look just specifically at the month of March, we were up 17.2% over March of 2021. The 12-month rolling average increased to 21.9%, up from the end of year where we were at 19%. So you're still seeing that trajectory on its way up. The key things that we'll be watching here will be the months of April and May. As you kind of take a look at this chart, we experienced 24 and 35% growth in those 2 months. So will we be able to sustain increases over and above those kind of growth rates that we experienced last year? So the first 3 months of last year were growing, but they weren't growing as much as what they were the rest of the year. So that will certainly bear a lot in terms of how we start relying upon information and projecting and estimating revenues as we go into the 2023 budget and the capital program. The other thing we're going to be monitoring, especially with such high inflation rates, is the portion of the growth that is truly related to growth, natural growth, economic growth in the community versus actual inflation. So as we talk about with property taxes, there's a CPI component and there is a growth component. And the same thing holds true with sales taxes. So we took a look at this and did some analysis, and discounting for the impact of inflation, we still were experiencing about 15% growth, just natural growth of the sales tax number here in the last 12 months. That goes down to 6%, about 6.4% if you look at the last 24 months. And if you look at the last 36 months, it's just under 6%. So it has been on an upward trajectory. And so far, you know, the inflation numbers, even when you discount for that, we're certainly seeing some good growth in terms of the overall sales tax. But before becoming, I guess, a little too positive in regard to that, we also have to recognize that during January of 26 to December of 28, or 2018, that 3-year period, our natural growth rate was about 1.5%. And we had a 1.5% inflation rate. So while certainly we're seeing a lot more growth here lately, how long that will be sustainable is yet to tell. But certainly it has had positive impact here over the last 24 months. The same holds true with the entertainment tax. You can see we still took a 22% increase in the entertainment tax side here over the March, and we're having a 12-month rolling average of about 36% overall. Similar to the sales tax numbers, you are going to see these numbers decrease pretty significantly over the next course of the next months, because we experienced 38 and 125% growth in April and May of last year. So again, we're not going to see that type of accelerated growth over those type of numbers. What's driving the entertainment tax numbers? Of course, restaurants, they comprised about 53% of the total amount, where our base for the sales taxes, or for the entertainment taxes, excuse me. And we've seen about that area, restaurants growing at about 17% so far this year in the first quarter. Lodging is the second largest of what comprises the entertainment tax. It's about 12% in the first 3 months of this year. It was up 28% in March, but it's been up about average 45% over the course of the first 3 months of this year. So very strong numbers coming in there, primarily driven a lot in large part by higher rates as opposed to occupancies. And then drinking establishments, that comprises about 8% of the tax base here, and that's been up about 20% year to date in the first quarter as well. So definitely seeing sizable growth there. Again, we're going to be looking at that growth versus inflation component over the next several months. But if you look at the last 24-month period, the growth rate that we were seeing for the entertainment tax after you account for inflation was about 7.5% overall. So again, solid growth over the last 2 years. But if you look at that 2016 to 2018 time period, it was growing at about 2.25%. So we're just in a little bit of a different time period right now, and we'll see again how long this is sustainable for our community as we go forward. If we take a look at the industries, and these are the top 10 industries in terms of the size and how much they contribute to our overall sales tax base, these 10 industries comprise about 60% of our total sales tax base. So what kind of driving our revenues in the first couple of months of this year? First and foremost, it's still on the remote retailers. That seems to be driving a lot of the growth that we're seeing. That's up $36 million in taxable sales here over the first 3 months, or about a 39% increase over the previous year. Wholesale goods, durable and goods is also a major driver there. That's been up. It was up $10 million in March, and it's up $34 million for the year. And then utilities up $33 million for the year, 48%. I'm going to guess that's being driven by those energy numbers we're certainly seeing on the inflationary side. Also seeing really good numbers in terms of restaurants, as we talked about before, and department stores, general merchandise stores. And then construction overall has been very good in the first quarter of this year as well. On the lodging tax side, kind of the same story we've seen in the previous months. You're seeing continued strong growth there. It's up about 43% when you look at it from a year-to-date standpoint, but you will see significant reductions here over the next several months as it becomes in line with the growth rates that we saw in the previous year. Occupancy overall in the lodging industry has returned to kind of our pre-pandemic levels. It's still very much more reliant now on leisure travel than it was previously, not completely seeing the rebound of business traffic that we'd seen previous to the pandemic itself. Then on the bid tax side, we had a 5% increase. This one's driven more by that occupancy side, so you don't see as strong a growth rate as you do on the lodging tax side, because that's going to be driven by those daily rates that they're charging. Overall on the revenue side, so we are a quarter of the way through the year. We've collected 19% of our projected budget, which is slightly ahead of where we were last year at 17% overall. Again, just as a reminder, we get a bulk of our property taxes coming into us in those in that May and October, November time period. So we always see a uptick as we get closer to hitting our normal budget numbers for that particular area. So right now, what we're seeing in terms of the growth, with us being up about $6 million over last year, it's driven by the $3 million that we've seen in increases in sales taxes over the same time period last year. And then the other thing that's contributing is on the licenses piece. We have about $2 million more just because of many of the liquor licenses that were issued so far, with more yet to issue, along with about a $640,000 increase in our permitting fees. On the expenditure side, you can see that we are presently have expended about 22% of our budget, being a quarter into the year. You'll see this is slightly ahead of where we were last year. We were at 20%. We were at about 21% the year before that. There is kind of an accounting piece that you should be aware of that's driving that to a certain extent. So typically we do one large sweep every year into the work comp fund and into the property and liability insurance pool. These are all just internal transfers, and then the third one goes into the technology fund as well. And last year we did those in July, and we moved them up into the first quarter this year, so we actually executed those transfers, those one-time transfers in March, because it will be better for us in terms of budgeting and forecasting, as well as the fact that the intent is the money is to be in that fund to be expended during that current year. So by having moved that up, that was in totality about $6.2 million in transfers that were made into those funds in March as opposed to in July. So if you discount for that, we would actually be about 19% spent for this year, so very comparable to where we were previously. And you can see the impact that has for fire and police. They were impacted both by increases in wages for both of those departments, but obviously on work comp and so forth, they do get assessed a little bit more relative to some of the other departments, just based on the types of services and so forth that they provide. The last thing I wanted to point out is if you have your monthly financial report in front of you, I'm going to ask if you would turn to page 16. And I just wanted to highlight a few things. So on page 16, this has been in the report probably for the last 5 or 6 months now, since probably early winter or late fall of 2021. But this is basically where we've laid out where all of kind of the CARES Act cash balances that we accumulated, or the additional reserves, I guess, assembled as a result of the reimbursements we received through the CARES Act, as well as the ARPA dollars. And so this is where we've been tracking that here. There's a couple of changes that are just based off of some of the actions that this council took last week, and I just want to point them out. Like under fire, you'll see that we removed the $2.5 million from ARPA. That is instead is now going to be funded by the available cash balance in the sales tax account. You'll see the addition of the Eat Well Sioux Falls for the $400,000. You'll see a reduction of the Cornice and Parapet project, ARPA funded from 4.6 million now down to 2.2 million. You can see the River Greenway, so the 2 million that's coming from the Pavilion project, as well as the 2.5 million that is coming from the Public Safety Training Facility, all now sitting within the River Greenway project for 4.5 million. We switched the YMCA amount, or not the amount is still the same at 500,000. We're no longer going to fund it with ARPA dollars, and so we'll use some of the cash balances there. The reason for that, the Treasury introduced a final rule in January of this year after we had kind of made these assumptions of where the ARPA dollars were going to be spent, and it just was very difficult for me to find a route through that final rule that really was very clear in terms of the eligibility of the enumerated use of those funds. And so, and if we did do it, we would do it in such a way that it would become so burdensome for them in reporting, asking questions of people that are using the facility that, you know, in terms of incomes and so forth, that just is not practical given the type of services that they provide and the type of relationships that they have and the people that they serve. So to make it more simple, that was switched into an LGA and freed up that $500,000 as well. The other one you'll see, it's not on here anymore, is the Arboretum. That's going to be in the same situation, just not comfortable that it should be funded with ARPA. So we'll use general fund dollars to fund that agreement. Same amounts that we had talked about previously. No change there, just won't be using the ARPA dollars there. You'll note the Butterfly House is still on there. That's the one that's not appropriated currently. That expired at the end of the last year. So I just wanted to reiterate that again. When that moves forward, we would have to reappropriate those funds at that particular time. The workforce diversification was put at $3.5 million because we were using the $500,000 for the Discovery District that we already had budget, plus the $3.5 million through the LGA. And then we did break down, so we had $3 million that was going to the housing fund. We've now broken that out from 1.4 million to specify that that's going to the Emergency Safety and Home Grant Program that was discussed here over the last couple of weeks, and they still have a 1.6 million to obligate to other projects yet, and those haven't yet been determined. And with all of the switches, we now have an uncommitted balance of ARPA funds of about $550,000 that you'll see at the very bottom. It probably should say ARPA next to it. So those are ARPA dollars because of all of these kind of changes that are now not specifically designated to a project, or and we have until the end of 2024 to expend these funds. So I guess I would recommend that we just hold it as uncommitted for a while here and kind of see where additional funds or programs could be utilized. There's a number of places that it could be obligated to. It could go to the wastewater project. It's a simple use of any ARPA dollars. It could be utilized for additional resources to some of the agencies that we funded if the need arises, or for an expansion of services. But I don't think we have to rush to make a decision on that and can just potentially leave them uncommitted as an available use for the future. But I do want to bring your attention to that, is that they are now not committed, and that's due again to that YMCA switch out of ARPA, as well as the Arboretum. And we had thought about using it just for general government services. It's an eligible thing. Maybe use it for the seasonal staff increases that we've had to do in order to attract staffing for seasonal and part-timers. But we think that the tracking will be very painful to try to do that, and it just isn't always the cleanest way to do it. So we decided that we'd just leave it as uncommitted at this point in time. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. I'll go to the phone. I know we have counselors on the phone. Do you have any questions?
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
this is Alex. Say, Sean, I have a question, and just kind of help me understand this with our timing. Of course, inflation is inflating all of the prices of our big projects that we have going on, and the bond rating, or the bonds that we've went out to market for, we're in a pretty good position there for long-term debt financing with the bonds that we've produced. Is that accurate?
You're saying, well, I think looking back, like right now, you know, certainly coming out of pandemic, we were unsure exactly what the pricing of the bonds would be. We priced in a very good position when we went out with the public safety bond. And so we were in a good place there. If, the question is, do we advance the quality of life bond quicker, thinking that we might have more challenging interest rates ahead? We typically have just timed those bonds as needed because you don't want to sit and hold a bunch of cash as well that you're paying interest on and going into repayment early, so you have cash flow issues there. But overall, in terms of when we've refunded bonds or taken bonds out, we're in a very good position there. On the wastewater side, those are set interest rates by the state, and so we always benefit from those interest rates overall. And then the last thing I would say is, and we talked a little bit about this last week during the end-of-year financials presentation, and you'll note this if you go to the general fund summary page, which would be on page 1 of your financials, labeled page 1 of the financials, where you take a look at the general fund. You can see our investment revenue presently is a negative $812,000, and that is that mark-to-market issues that we were talking about, that we're probably going to see negative in terms of investment income over the course of this year. It's not a loss, it's a non-cash loss, but we have to show it. We hold those securities till maturity anyway, so we always get the return we expect when we acquire those treasury notes, but we always have to mark them depending on what the market is on a given point in time. Hope that answers your question, Alex.
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you, Sean.
Anybody else on the phone? Okay, other questions, councilors? Councilor Starr?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Your slide 7, my page 4 on the presentation, the year-to-date residential permits. It's awesome that we're doubled up on the multifamily, but doesn't it seem concerning that we're not, that the single-family homes aren't hitting the market, that we're a year behind? We all keep talking about the need for housing in the city, and we're not seeing it, at least not, year to year or year over year. So, and then the Fed's raising interest rates, which make those single family houses continue to be more expensive. I'm assuming most of the deals up through March, have been financed prior to that because, it's a trailing indicator, because the building permit's probably the last thing you do before you start building. So all the other services are in place and ready to go. So it's taken months to get to this point. Can we make up that difference? I guess that's where, we're speculating of what's going on in the market, but we're not seeing the single family housing starts that you would think would be there.
So, I think what you're seeing is a product of a disrupted economy post-pandemic to a certain extent. So supply will chase demand in great extent. If the cost of building is so high, and with interest rates also increasing, it's going to price people out of the residential market. The only choice that they have then potentially is renters. Now, is there a market shift to people maybe wanting to be more renters than owning homes? I don't know that that's necessarily the case. But you do have a lot of people that, they like the flexibility of the renting, especially if you're a younger generation. We know that this employment right now is much more mobile. They're more likely to leave their current employment quickly and to move to other places. And so when you rent, you obviously have flexibility. You don't have the roots tied down. Long-term policy perspective is, in my mind, is you always like to see home ownership. That sets roots, it sets culture for community. It's an opportunity to create equity and wealth as an individual. Probably the best way to do that is by owning your home. And that's becoming, at this time, not a great opportunity for many people, and that's unfortunate. But it's the market is too strong to counteract. We do what we can to help promote affordable housing, but at the same time, you're always going to have the market in many ways drive what's going to happen.
It's just, like I said, we keep talking about it and we're not seeing a change.
No.
And so we continue to not make the progress that we're going to need to as we grow the economy, as we have more people move in, and we see it in every price range from starter homes all the way to executive homes. So,
and I think the bigger issue will be the supply shortages, the lumbers, the skilled labor. where when that supply unfreezes, then you can see more small builders getting back in the market and being able to make it work, or to get lots to be able to do that. But right now, the challenge is they can't find people to work and they can't find the materials, and then you can't price it. I wouldn't be as concerned about the increase in interest rates. While it might be, somebody who's, 30 years or younger never experienced a 6.5% interest rate. Most of us have in our lifetime, and we still bought homes. So.
And that's the intended goal in the macro economy is slowing that home building down and slowing some of those things, or slowing the economy down. And it's that's the opposite of inflation. Is we're going to have to try to get through and land softly and not end up in a recession. And I mean, that's just by definition, that's if you stop inflation, you're so close to going back the other direction. So it just, like I said, for all the talk, we're just not seeing the results that we're going to need to see to continue for the city to grow and attract new people to town and do that part of it. So it'll be interesting. One other place that I wanted to make sure that I was in the right place, because we haven't talked about this yet, the $150,000 that we have to pay in the settlement fee for the parking ramp, where does that come from? Isn't that part of the insurance liability?
Yes, it was paid from the property and liability insurance pool.
Does that transfer into the enterprise fund first and then paid from the enterprise fund?
No, they have a set amount that they take from across the city. So if there's a loss taken, like a deductible is paid out of there or a loss is taken, usually the intent is to recover it over time, but not to impact that one individual fund or department specifically if it can be identified to that department.
So when that fee was paid originally as a non-refundable deposit, where did those funds go?
That was paid to the parking fund.
So the money's in the parking fund, but we're paying the settlement from a different place. So we're taking a non-refundable deposit that was made and given to the parking fund, and then we're paying for it out of the general liability fund.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, but when you look at the bigger picture, so the parking fund, kind of became I don't want to say the quasi developer, but their intent was to build a parking ramp, right? And so the intent was those funds would be going into the parking fund, the full $1 million when it came in. Now the parking fund obviously also had to encumber the fact that it didn't get completed and spent $1.5 million of its funds because the project didn't reach completion. So it's still net negative in the parking fund. We had discussions about, where the funds should be paid from. Ultimately, we have a property and liability insurance pool that if we were paying a deductible or other type of litigation not specific to an individual department, that's where we would likely look for those funds to pay or to utilize because it's a risk management piece. And then the other piece of it is at what point is the parking fund, which is an enterprise fund, paid for by parking users responsible for what is truly an economic development initiative.
Totally agree that the users of the parking fund shouldn't be paying for the mistakes we made as outside of the government. And that's part of, the mistakes we made and the price all citizens should have to pay for, not just the members of the enterprise fund. Do we have all of the lawyer bills, mediation expenses and everything in-house so we have an idea what that is?
I don't know if we have the final bill or not. You'd have to refer that question to the attorney's office. They oversee that contract.
And they referred me to you the last time I asked. So, I mean, we're kind of in a circle of trying to get an answer to that question.
I will look into it, but I think that I'd have to go back and see if we've received a final bill for.
Okay, because I keep asking for where some of the bills were paid from, and they're saying, I don't know, we just hired people.
Yes, those had been being paid for by the public parking fund at the time. I think there might have been a point where we flipped it over to the party. I'll have to look into that too.
If you can get that for me, that would help. It just would make sense of trying to put a total picture of what happened. And, we talk about, we made mistakes, but we don't want to make them again. But if we don't admit what mistakes we made and we don't have a good tracking of where that is, we don't leave a very good paper trail for those that come after us and don't remember the mistakes that were made.
Sure.
Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Neitzer.
I have two subjects. The first is on page 16 of this financial report that goes into the ARPA that you talked about.
Yep.
There's a note at the bottom, second installment of ARPA funds to be received in July 2022 of approximately $12.7 million. I, I, I assume that we've already
Obligated those.
encumbered that? Okay, this is not
Yeah,
additional
not
dollars.
necessarily encumbered from the technical aspect of encumbered, but all of that, those funds were designated previously for where they would
Okay.
go to.
All right, so we've allocated those in these previous items. This is not new money.
Correct.
Okay,
No, we
all
just got it split between 2 years.
Okay. And then, as it relates to remote retailer sales, when I'm looking at the industry taxable sales data, so a couple of questions about that. First of all, I guess I would assume that probably most, if not all, would probably be, we would get 2% of it. It would probably just be general sales. So if there's $100 million in gross sales, we would get $2 million in sales tax.
Correct, yep.
Do we have enough data yet to know how much we're taking in per year and like what our, and I do wonder as well, even before the Supreme Court decision, if somebody had a physical presence here, they had to remit sales tax already. So it may be that some of this isn't a new, some of it may not be new, because if you bought something from Best Buy online, it may have been allocated in some other electronics or something like that. So this may not all be new money, but some is. So I guess
It's
the
fair.
simple question is, do we know how much we're getting in addition per year
It's hard
because
to
of
tell
this?
because we rely on the state on how they codify people into different categories. And it is a bit of a challenge because before the lawsuit, if you had bricks and mortar in the state, you paid it, even if it was online. If you didn't have bricks and mortar, you didn't have to pay it if you had no physical presence in that state.
Yeah.
And then, Wayfair versus South Dakota changed that. And then the state started changing the way they reported a little bit. And so it's really hard to make a determination. We try to look at that remote category, and you can certainly see that it's up dramatically, but it's hard to determine exactly, like if you were to say with specificity, this is exactly how much more we're taking in. I think we could get a pretty good ballpark of where we think it is. Certainly saw a dramatic change during the pandemic when you saw a ton of people buying online, and it really hasn't ceased since then overall. And yet, our local retail sector hasn't really been, aside from the really bad portions of the pandemic when things were closed, they've seen positive things happening too. I mean, when you see department stores and these are the big box retailers, they're still putting in numbers that are almost as strong in growth that you're seeing on the remote. So people are buying a lot of stuff, but there's been a lot of cash to buy stuff with too. Now with inflation and no more stimulus and all these things, is that sustainable? Probably not.
Okay, so when we look at the remote retailer sales, I mean, if I asked you and you came back and said we had, that category was $100 million, just for throwing a number out for a year, it may be hard to extrapolate from that how much is new incremental, because first of all, you may have behavior changes where somebody was buying something at a brick and mortar, but because of COVID, they started buying online, and so they went over to this other online retailer, so that isn't a net increase for us, it's just a transfer to a different category. And then you also have, for example, if again, like I suppose if remote retailer sales, however they categorize that, maybe we don't know exactly how they do that. Like for example, if Best Buy sales was in some other category and now it's over in this other one and it would have grown anyway. I guess I'm just wondering, if there's any way to know if now we're getting an extra $3 million a year in revenue, and then because of that, we could go, let's say, eliminate the tax on food, and it would just be a wash. I'd be just theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at what the totality, I mean, we have the numbers broken down for the last probably 3 years for all these categories. So we could say remote retailer was, we could say it was this in 19 and it was this in 2020 and 21. And that's going to give you a pretty good snapshot of the remote. I would think since Wayfair, I think they've become a little bit more in terms of how they're allocating things to remote retailer. But you still, I don't know, if Amazon builds a warehouse here, is it still remote retailer because they have bricks and mortar in our state? I don't know how the state is going to treat that. Or, any number of other retailers that people buy online that suddenly finally decides to build a, a retail outlet locally, physically, will they switch them to another category? I would think that they would have to, but it's very challenging to be able to track it.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know in an entity there where they have a brick and mortar here and they have an online presence. Like if it gets somebody buys something from one of those, does it get split out or does it get all dumped in one bucket? So it'd be interesting to know.
Maybe they're reporting physical sales versus online sales, but what is online anymore? You buy it online, it gets delivered from the
Sure.
store.
Or you go down to the store and pick it up. So if I
Right.
buy a book at Barnes & Noble online and I drive down and pick it up, is that a online sale?
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's the hard part. It's almost at the point where you can't, in my mind, decipher too much between it. What we do know is that it has picked up significantly in terms of people's online buying habits. And so there's been a shift in that sector for sure, but it's hard to decipher without looking at the data.
Okay, and then the last question, if I could, related to, I can't remember if it was was it sales tax on cable internet that got eliminated?
It was, it's on internet services, and that was I think it took effect in the middle of 2020.
Yeah, and that was just a portion, so the internet portion of my bill was no longer taxable, but the cable piece still was, or whatever it was.
Yep, and you can completely see it. There's two categories that were loss leaders the last 18 months or so, or 24 months, and you can definitely see the impact. They were all went negative for a good portion of the last 16 months, and it's all driven by that. Trying to think. We had estimated what we thought the impact was going to be when the federal law changed on that. I wanted to say it was $1.5 to $2 million.
I was gonna say, it feels like it was maybe 1.5 million or something we
Yeah.
talked about. Did it end up being what you
I think
expected?
it was
and did
pretty
you?
close to what we expected it was going to hit, yeah.
And-
I looked at that number once, and I can't remember, but
Yeah.
I can get it to you.
And adjustments were made and I suppose with so much all other volatility
during
and growth in
COVID,
sales
so
tax, so it was all over
It's
the
kind of
place.
yeah, I mean, if
So-
you think about it, though, we during COVID, that year 2020, we grew at 0%, It's pretty much the year we were losing the internet sales tax. And so had we not lost that, we might not have taken a dip that year as opposed to what we did. So, but
Sure.
remote retailers kind of blew up too, so.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Other questions? I have none.
All right.
So thank you very much
bet.
for a
Thank
great
you.
presentation. At this time, we move to public comment. Anybody would like to comment on the financials, come forward.
Scott Ersman, Sioux Falls. First thing, there was no roll call, so we don't have no idea who was on the phones. Well, we know one person who was on the phone because they spoke, but we don't know if there was anybody else on the phone. I just think it's kind of strange considering that, we're always talking about who's showing up and what the attendance is, and should have had a roll call to know that. And I still have a problem with people doing this remotely from their home.
Scott, we're here about the financials.
Okay, just should have done a roll call. When we had that slide up there about the apartments, I don't believe the supply chain and the lumber costs and other construction costs. When you buy lumber to build an apartment building or buy lumber to buy a house, it costs the same. So let's just face it, it's cheaper, it's more revenue to build apartment buildings. Developers make more money at it. That's just plain and simple. Because we are not finding a way to incentivize builders to build single-family homes. The apartment permits were 2 times what they were in 2021. They are 8 times more than what they were in 2019. That's not a supply chain lumber problem, cost problem. That is what we're prioritizing as a city to allow. As for the financials, there's been a lot of talk about people complaining that we didn't get a financial report before the election. Hey, I've been following the city politics for years. I know what time the financial report comes out. It comes out after the audit. Date's the same every year. I know when the date is. That's not the problem here, folks. That has nothing to do with anything or when the audit and the financial report, yearly financial report comes. The problem is you are handing out millions and millions and millions of dollars from the year before when you don't have an audit or a financial report. All of that stuff should have took place after the report. And even if you did do it that way, let's pretend that you actually did something the way you're supposed to do it. There should have been public meetings, there should have been working sessions, and the council is the ones that decide where the money's gonna go, not the mayor's office. That was the issue. The issue wasn't when the report was coming out. How can you give away millions and 15 million to DSU and USD and ice rinks, and I can't even keep track of all the millions of dollars you guys handed out before the election. But we didn't have an audit. We didn't even have an audit report or a financial report. But somehow we could get City Hall to hand it over to the council and hand away millions of dollars without this report. How do you do that? How does that work? And not have any public input about any of it, except when it was handed to the meeting at the meeting. It's unbelievable the millions and millions of dollars you guys gave away before you even had a financial or an audit report. It's kind of, it doesn't look good, I can tell you that. But of course, our great media of this town doesn't like to cover things like that. The other thing that I've been watching, and it came up today, Deutschland Bank said that they were going to have a very, very severe recession. They interviewed Goldman Sachs. They said, well, it could go either way. That's the other problem with spending all of these subsidies without knowing what would happen. I remember in 2008, I was up here talking about the platting fees and saying that it was a bad time to go in that direction with it. Oh, the developers, they're going to pay 60, 50, 60, 70% of the platting fees. That never happened for years and years and years. Why? Because of a recession. But instead of, putting this money away or giving property tax cuts, if you really want to have more housing in this town, you need to cut property taxes. We're just spending it, throwing it out, doing it before any audits, doing it before any financial reports, doing it before any public input from anybody, and a recession's on the horizon. Two of the largest banks in the world, one says it's going to be bad, the other says it could go either way. And while I got a couple seconds left, when are we ever going to see the pavilion finances in the Levitt? That would be nice. We haven't seen the pavilions in years. There hasn't been a presentation in years. Yet we're giving them millions of dollars for, I don't know, some fiberglass crap up there. I don't know what it is.
Anyone else for public input?
Mr. Chair, then before, he did a good job of pointing out that we needed a roll call. Can we do a roll call now, at least at the end, to put it in the record of who attended?
We've never done a roll call on information.
At an information?
Since I've been here, we have never done a roll call.
Thank you.
But I will point out, I know that Alex Jensen and Marshall Selber were on the phone. I know that for a fact. So I just would like, before we adjourn, the next informational meeting will be scheduled for May 4th, 2022.
Good.
Thank you.